Hello, I'm Bronwyn Kelly, the founder of Australian Community Futures Planning, and this is part 3 of episode 2 in our series explaining National Integrated Planning and Reporting, or what I otherwise like to call how Australians can rise above politics and set the agenda for the nation's future. In episode 1 of this series, I set out some introductory context for National IP&R. I spoke about its purpose, why it's coming to the fore as an important means of strengthening democracy at the outset of the 2020s, and how it is already being used to help Australians build their first National Community Futures Plan, Australia Together. In the first 2 parts of episode 2, I moved on to explain how National IP&R works in practice, how it is a new process combining 8 elements of community engagement and long-term planning, including long-term financial planning for optimising the way the nation's wealth is raised and shared. I set out how we can use the first 5 elements of National IP&R to visualise the future and set ourselves up with better protections in crises like pandemics, global financial shocks and climate change. In this third and last part of episode 2, I'll set out how the last 3 elements work. Element number 6, open and transparent comment channels. Element 7, the Australia Together National Wellbeing Index. And element 8, the end of term report. These are the elements we can use to create a much more constructive relationship with elected leaders and guide them about where we want the nation to go and how we want to get there. So let's see how these work. In part 1 of this episode, I set out the 8 elements of National IP&R, and so far I've covered how the first 5 work in practice. The first of those elements was open community engagement, and for that we need a dedicated, well-organised, open public space on the internet, a space where we can hear each other and work together to plan our way towards the best future we can imagine. I also said that we need a vision statement about the quality of life we wish to have by 2050 or sooner, and that this statement needs to be short enough to be easily connected with, but specific enough to help us ensure we're tracking towards the right things, the things we really aspire to, all of them. And I said we need signposts of the safe directions towards the vision, and that these signposts need to be set up within a map, one which shows our targets and helps us select strategies that follow the directions. These 4 elements give us a solid structure for the integrated plan that we can build, Australia Together, our first National Community Futures Plan. But to make sure the vision and directions are those that we really want, we need not just a public open space on the internet, but a way to be orderly in our commentary within that space. This is where element number 6 comes in. Ongoing community opinion surveys and orderly comment channels about what should be going in and out of the plan as time passes. These are necessary to continuously check support for each iteration of Australia Together, and they're necessary to seek suggestions on how to make it stronger over time. What this means is that it's not enough to know that there is a public open communication space on the internet where people can see planning and reporting going on throughout each election cycle. They have to have orderly ways of injecting their views into it. Orderly commentary is vital, otherwise we will end up back with the cacophony of the internet. This means that a quality process of National IP&R must facilitate commentary and suggestions through well-written forms and surveys that make it possible for everyone to understand each other. This is a lot harder than it might sound, and ACFP will continue to work on the forms that will facilitate the genuine conversations we would like to make possible for anyone who wishes to move into this public square of National Community Futures Planning. Overall, though, The structure of the plan itself is the main thing that is most likely to assist people to follow what's going on in the planning and contribute meaningful and constructive commentary on the things that are most important to them. Australia Together is structured so that we can keep the map simple and easy to follow. A national plan could become very complicated if it were poorly structured, but that needn't happen at all. We can construct a map that is easy to follow using a simple layout that connects the facts of our present position in terms of wellbeing and security with the position we wish to reach in the future, expressed as targets. Which brings me to the seventh element of National IP&R, a tracking system based on a National Wellbeing Index. ACFP is making national integrated planning and reporting possible in a number of ways, including by designing a structure for Australia Together and by devising the democratic workings of the national IP&R process itself. But another critical contribution by ACFP is the construction of the Australia Together National Wellbeing Index. This index is simply a set of statistical and other facts about the state of health of our society, environment, economy and democracy in the early 2020s. Without this, Australians won't be able to build a national plan. The index is being built progressively, and by mid-2021 it contained over 200 indicators of national wellbeing, complete with baseline data, meaning it contained data on where we were in 2020 at the start of this 30-year planning period on over 200 indicators. This includes data about physical things like the state of our health or our scores on educational attainment for school children, or the state of our environment and biodiversity, or the state of the economy. It also includes data about our perceptions of our well-being and our satisfaction with our quality of life. And it includes facts about current features of culture, such as our attitudes to diversity and our preferences for peace and security. And finally, it includes facts about major policies currently in force in Australia that will have a substantial effect on our wellbeing and security, such as policies affecting economic growth and labour productivity, or policies which affect the health of ecosystems, or policies which affect the health of our democracy, such as the fact that we do not have a federal independent commission against corruption, or policies which affect our security, such as the fact that we have a policy to become one of the top 10 military arms and weapons exporters in the world. These are all parts of the picture of our current well-being, security and preparedness for the future. It's important to paint them in full so that we can see what we are and where we are as a nation. From there, we can decide where we want to go as a nation. A picture of a nation's health has never been painted in one place like this before, but it's essential to our ability to plan a better future. The Australia Together National Wellbeing Index is expected to grow from just over 200 indicators in 2021 to well over 300 indicators in due course. ACFP has been able to begin putting this together due to research carried out by me as its founder in my book, By 2050, Planning a Better Future for Our Children in 21st Century Democratic Australia. Apart from using the writing of this book to devise a workable national IP&R process, the research in it established many of the facts of Australia's capacity, strengths and weaknesses as a modern economy and democracy in 2020. This painted an accurate and quite detailed picture of our preparedness for the future. Links to By 2050 are provided in the description on the YouTube page for this video. The conclusion? Well, we are by no means well prepared, but we can plan our way towards something much better. To do that well, we have to know not only where we want to get to by 2050 or sooner, but also where we are starting from. Hence the need to build the Australia Together National Wellbeing Index. It gives us the starting points. To help Australians become familiar with these starting points, Much of the research and the statistical findings in By 2050 have been summarised in ACFP's 7-part YouTube videocast series, The State of Australia in 2020. In this series, ACFP has concentrated on isolating 20 key areas where, as a nation, Australia has sunk into particular weaknesses and become vulnerable to particular threats. It's not a happy picture. Our social cohesion is declining and inequality is rising. Several physical and mental health problems are rising and access to education is declining. Biodiversity, and with it our natural resources, particularly water, are under serious threat. Climate change impacts are very close to being beyond control. The economy has been getting steadily weaker and structurally more unstable by the year, even before COVID-19. Participation and trust in democracy have declined. Our international relations are deteriorating. And aside from general approval of the authorities' response to COVID-19, a variety of surveys of the opinions of Australians about their personal happiness and their satisfaction with the way many things are going in Australia suggests that a significant proportion of the Australian population is not happy with the direction of the nation. These findings are based on assembled statistics and facts gathered by ACFP from hundreds of sources, including academic researchers, journalists, historians, scientists, economists and policy commentators. This is where we are in the early 2020s. It's not good, but it's better to know it now when we can still do something about it before it gets worse. We can still fix it. These are the 20 key areas of policy and services that we need to fix in the decade to 2030 if we expect to arrive safely in 2050 with an acceptable degree of well-being and security. If we can fix these things, we will enormously increase our chances of a wonderful quality of life in the future. If we fail to fix them, our quality of life will surely decline and bills will be unaffordable for future generations. The Australia Together National Wellbeing Index is being built by loading the data about where we are in 2020 into Australia Together. By mid-2021, approximately half of the data had been loaded, and for each of these starting points, a preferred target to reach by 2050 or sooner had been selected. And in many cases, a draft strategy to help meet the targets on time via the safe routes had been included. Only strategies which fit with the vision and follow the safe route signposts have been selected in the starting drafts of Australia Together. Many more will be added over the decade to 2030. Some will be removed if researchers or the Australian community find that they don't fit or that we can do something better. But it's a start, and it offers the possibility of a substantial boost to the nation's capacity, strength and preparedness. Using this system, the map is coming together. We are laying out the baseline data in the index to paint accurate pictures of our current well-being and security. Then we can set our aim so that we move safely towards each target, from starting points like this one on labour productivity, which in 2019 was a shocker at negative 0.4%. Labour productivity in that year went backwards, and this was before COVID-19. But we can aim to move over to a target for productivity that we know is the minimum necessary if we are to grow the economy, a target in the range of 1.6% per annum. Every economist and the Treasury analysts know that that target is the minimum necessary to help Australia become the things we are aiming for in the vision. It also fits with the directions. By pursuing that target for productivity, we are following key signposts that set us on a safe course towards the things we want to become as a nation. We're not running counter to the signposts. In this case, we're hoping to get the economy growing sustainably. We're hoping to move away from excessive consumption of scarce resources and be a model of employment planning and justice in industry transitions. This is not a target about economic growth for growth's sake. It's a target for justice for everyone in the massive economic structural transition that we must make if we're to maintain our quality of life at all. And distributed throughout the plan in a way that we can't lose sight of them are the strategies that will propel us toward that target. Here I'm going to use my education example again. It's a strategy for reintroduction of fee-free tertiary education, something that will be vital to the restoration of labour productivity and something that is vital to economic growth because the economic benefit is bigger than the cost. That strategy follows the same signposts as the productivity target. In fact, strategies like that one propel us toward the achievement of multiple targets. There is a close link between increased access to affordable tertiary education and our ability to meet targets like this one, for instance, our commitment to meet the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. These are goals the Australian government has signed on to do things like eliminate poverty and hunger, and yes, to ensure equal access for all women and men to affordable and quality technical, vocational and tertiary education, including university, and to substantially increase the number of youth and adults who have relevant skills, including technical and vocational skills, for employment, decent jobs and entrepreneurship. In 2015, the Australian government under Prime Minister Turnbull committed to achieve these things for Australians by 2030, although as yet no federal funding has been set aside in its budgets for any of the 17 goals we have adopted, and no planning has been undertaken to achieve them. The goals we have committed to here and elsewhere cannot be achieved without a national integrated plan. More than that, these goals cannot be achieved with existing policies because there is little, if any, match between current government policies on the economy, the environment and social equity, and the draft vision and directions of an inclusive plan like Australia Together. Many current federal and state government policies run along unsafe paths that don't match either the draft vision or the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. They're simply not up to the challenge of meeting the commitments we have already made to each other as Australians under the United Nations goals. But with Australia Together, we can make up for the government's obvious lack of care. We can pivot to the safe paths, like this one, which has benefits for both landholders and climate change. All the strategies in Australia Together are connected to and aimed squarely at targets that we must reach if we are to pass on a decent standard of living to the next generations and maintain or improve the present standard for current generations. But more than that, the strategies and targets are connected in such a way as to help us see that they are likely to be the right strategies and targets because they take us towards the agreed destination, not away from it, and they take us there via the safest directions. This is integration at work to produce a plan that can give us confidence that we have picked the right strategies. Hopefully, this will prevent us making mistakes like the one we made some decades ago to deny our kids the affordable tertiary education we had. Avoiding mistakes is a key virtue of integrated planning. In fact, it's a benefit that we can only grasp if we have National IP&R. Some of the weak strategies and big mistakes we could have prevented if we had had National IP&R 30 or even just 20 years ago include our foolish repeal in 2014 of the price we had put on carbon in 2012, a highly regrettable move which stopped Australia making enormous income from carbon permits trading in international markets and stymied us in our ability to reduce carbon emissions at the lowest cost. We could also have avoided the mistake of subsidising fossil fuels in preference to renewable energy, a lamentable misstep since all the profit made possible by the enormous subsidisation of fossil fuels went offshore to foreign-owned multinationals who paid little if any tax and within the last decade shared none of the profit with Australians in wage rises. We would have avoided the foolish repeal of the mineral resources rent tax, a move which effectively stopped many of the benefits of mining profits spreading through the economy, transferring them instead to largely foreign-owned companies who have paid little, if any, tax. Other mistakes we could have avoided include the $300 billion worth of tax cuts we legislated in 2019, which will do nothing but accelerate growing inequality and expose Australians to loss of vital services in health, education and social security. We could have stopped the sale of profitable government trading enterprises and assets like airports and ports and databases containing our land and property details. We could have stopped selling them as monopolies for a fraction of their worth, all of which has had the effect of reducing competition within Australia's economy instead of increasing it, and siphoning profits away from the many to a tiny few. And we could have skipped misguided policies like robo-debt and the cashless welfare card, which have weakened our social security and cohesion, created expensive mental health problems, not to mention domestic violence and suicide, and resulted in more than $1 billion that must be paid by taxpayers in compensation and legal fees. We also could have avoided stripping the public service of much of its intellectual capacity and independence, and we could have avoided the conflicts of interest and extra bills that arise from using expensive consultants to provide advice of a lower quality. This is just a small selection of the mistakes we could have avoided. The list of roads we didn't take but should have is a long one. Still, with National IP&R, we can settle ourselves into an easy-to-manage cycle of review so that even if we choose the wrong strategy or an ineffective one, we can spot the mistake before we've done too much damage and replace it with something more effective. This is what the eighth and last element of National IP&R is for, the end-of-term report. No planning system is worth much if we can't produce reports on performance. These are vital if we're to keep ourselves on track and accelerate our progress towards targets. As I said before, National IP&R is a new process that we can inject into our existing process of democracy, meaning our election cycles. The end-of-term report comes in the last part of that cycle. The full cycle starts immediately after an election, very much in the way Australian Community Futures Planning started the first ever cycle of National Integrated Planning and Reporting after the 2019 federal election, although ACFP had to figure out how to make IP&R work at the national level, and this created a delay in the first cycle. Once we got going, though, with a robust process that could be applied efficiently and effectively at the national level, we picked up speed, at least in the planning part of the cycle. We got as far as assembling a draft vision and directions based on the demonstrated views of Australians about what they want for their future. We also started importing large amounts of baseline data into the plan and assembling targets and strategies in relation to those data points. And we also opened up comment periods on the vision and directions to create a reliable foundation for ongoing planning. We also produced a videocast series on the state of Australia in 2020. This functioned as the equivalent of an end-of-term report from the previous federal parliament's term of office, except that it was more like an end-of-term report about Australia's progress during the first 2 decades of the 21st century. This resulted in an assessment that Australia is tracking away from the draft vision of Australia Together, not towards it. But it also enabled us to identify the top 20 priority areas we need to fix if we're to be able to track back the other way, towards the vision. With all that, and if there is time in the first election cycle, ACFP may be able to produce an end-of-term report for the federal election in 2022. Ideally, future cycles of National IP&R would allow for community engagement in long-term financial planning. That hasn't been possible in the first cycle. If resources permit, an end-of-term report in National Integrated Planning and Reporting is ideally delivered to Australians just before a federal election. We take the data in Australia Together and check, wherever we can, whether we have moved from a baseline point in the right directions towards the vision or whether we've moved away from it. It's a simple graphic dashboard where red means we've moved away from the vision and green means we've moved towards it. I say that we check wherever we can, partly because ACFP itself needs resources to do this, and partly because even if we do have resources, it's not always possible to find data about the direction in which we have moved, especially if the government has cut funding to major data collectors like the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Another limiting factor is that some election cycles are just too short for any change to be discernible, although I have observed that it only takes a short time for things to get worse, so quite noticeable negative changes can be reported in a short parliament, whereas with our democracy set up as it is now, it takes much longer to make things noticeably better, because parliaments are not geared to do things as quickly as they could if they had a plan. But leaving that aside, an end-of-term report can generally be organised to provide results on whether we have moved closer to the vision or further away from it during a federal government's term of office. It can also isolate areas of failure and suggest areas where policy adjustment may help get the plan back on track. And it can provide an opportunity to consider changes to the plan itself if the community thinks that is advisable. The end-of-term report can also help Australians decide which political party agendas going forward will fit with the vision and directions and which won't. It can give us clearer insights into the forward effects of policies on the politicians' menus. Because the plan is built into the sequence of democracy and our elections so that we can plan first and then vote, it gives us a way of deciding how we prefer to vote, based on whether a party's agenda really aligns with the national interest, with the interests of future generations, and our own long-term interest as individuals. It can do this simply by listing the policies of all major parties and showing whether they run in the safe directions or counter to the safe directions. This might be difficult or less helpful if parties don't announce policies or if they run their campaigns with very few or poorly explained policies, or confine themselves strictly to short-term platforms such as buying voters with promises of tax cuts, sports grants or other pork barrelling. In that case, readers of the end-of-term reports would be reduced to having to judge parties' policies based on their actions and good faith during the term and decide for themselves whether there is an acceptable degree of good faith, ethics and competence in a political party. This might reduce us once again to having to place blind faith in politicians as we do now, which is not a good basis for rebuilding trust. But if politicians decided to play the game in poor faith, by being silent particularly on commitments to our long-term interests, the end-of-term report at least leaves us with more guidance than we have had before on what we are trading off by accepting whatever is on offer in the short term that isn't so good for the long term. We can see where we are trading away long-term benefits in exchange for the short-lived and usually smaller gains on offer in party political platforms. The end-of-term report is capable of helping voters make their own decision about what's in their short-term interests because it provides evidence of what has and hasn't worked in the period to meet targets such as those for productivity or wage growth. But beyond that, the report adds something extra that is vital. It gives us the ability to consider what the real trade-offs are between short and long-term interests, because there is almost always a trade-off. And politicians work very hard in election campaigns to stop us thinking about what that trade-off really is. But Australia Together makes the trade-offs clear. From there, we are all free to choose whatever trade-off is best for us as individuals or best overall, because we are likely to have more information about the value of what we are trading away in long-term gains by accepting the short-term offers. We will, for instance, have information about how much cheaper in the long run it will be to abandon fossil fuels than it will be to do nothing about climate change. This actually helps us start a new type of dialogue with local members and candidates. We will have information behind us showing what we think needs to change and why. It significantly raises the quality of the conversations we have with each other and with politicians. Over time, we should be able to lift the quality of dialogue and reduce the ideological adversarialism of our current political arrangements. One of the great advantages of National IP&R, plans like Australia Together and end-of-term reports, is they give us countless opportunities to improve the quality of our communications and relationships with elected leaders over time. They can help us all hear each other. At the start of these episodes on how National IP&R works, I spoke of the need to establish a new public open space on the internet, a place where we can communicate with each other and build our plan for the Australia we want together. That activity of planning together and reporting openly on progress towards or away from the targets of our plan will help us transform our relationship with our leaders. We can telegraph our instructions to them, as it were, because we found a way to speak coherently to them. The means by which we can do that is via Australia Together, by the evidence in it, and by feeding back to them our reports about how well the nation is going against that particular plan. If we're going badly, we can all see whether it's because elected governments have ignored the plan and moved us away from where we want to go, or because the plan itself is the issue. Either way, we get a chance to correct things before we do too much more damage, and we get the opportunity to foresee the challenges and prepare for them or head them off before it's too late. Everyone is better off, including the politicians. Life could be so much easier for Australians if we can get everyone on the same page, on the safe paths to the future we can share, the paths to shared prosperity. If we made Australia Together come true, and we can, it would be the most wonderful place to live. There's nothing to stop us making it a reality if we adopt National IP&R. Throughout these explanatory videos, I've said that National IP&R is an easy and simple process. Having gone through the detail of the 8 components, some might think it's not that simple, particularly the long-term financial planning element. But as far as interacting with the process goes, it is very simple and efficient. This new process simply requires people to slightly change the way they already participate in democracy, to add an extra easy step. This is a small change, but with it we can get a big gain in influence and control over the future. The points at which everyday Australians can interact with the National IP&R process are not complicated. In fact, they only ask each of us to do something we've been expecting politicians to do, but that in reality can only be done properly by we, the people. The process simply asks us to say what we want for the future together. Say what we want for our kids, nieces, nephews and grandkids. Say what we want to avoid along the way. Say what would make us happy. Say what strategies we prefer because they fit with the vision, but say it in one place. This is something we need to tell politicians clearly and do it in a process where it is also clear that we expect them to listen and not to try to pit us against each other. Give them our menu, our map, our plan by building it together. If we think they're going to take us to our preferred future without our having specified where we want to go and what we want to become along the way, and if we think they're going to take us there without our plan for the safe paths, then both we and our politicians are deluding ourselves. Everyone is making their lives harder by running towards the future without a map. And in the 21st century, with our internet, our education, our intelligence, our ability to work together, it's unnecessary. Over the last decade, Australians have been asked in lots of different surveys, research programs and community forums what they want for the future. what for them would constitute progress. What do they want to become as a nation? And they have given of their views freely. When we have responded in these conversations and forums, we have always been staggeringly similar in our descriptions of the future we would be happy to share. And this staggering similarity of views has applied despite the fact that we are a diverse, multicultural nation. It's always been about safety, health, fairness, freedom, inclusion, and opportunity. But politicians, especially at the federal level, have been able to ignore it all and scatter us in different directions because none of it has been assembled into a form where it can become the driver of a plan to make our aspirations a reality. Now it has. ACFP has taken Australians at their word and gathered what people have been saying about the future they wish to share into a draft vision and directions so that it forms the basis of a plan that can take us safely toward where we want to go and to what we want to become. So, involvement in the National IP&R process is to some extent something we already participate in. It's just that National IP&R helps us assemble our views, and because of this, it is now a lot easier and far less time-consuming to participate in democracy. It's certainly easier than trying to secure our future through time-consuming protest and activism, or by lobbying elected politicians, or by interacting with other parts of the democratic process that are essentially intimidating and which often go nowhere, like Senate committee hearings. Invaluable though they are, these are not inclusive processes. They are not genuine engagement among equals, and they're almost always about fixing a mess we have already made. They're rarely, if ever, about what we want to create. Australia needs good people to put themselves forward as politicians, but if they are to succeed in delivering what matters most to us, we need to instruct them in simple, coherent terms about what we are trying to achieve and what we want to become. And we need to set safe paths for our leaders and watch whether they stick to them. National IP&R makes it easy for us to do this for the first time. I hope Australians have found this introduction to National Integrated Planning and Reporting useful. It is still new, but at ACFP we're going to continue working to make sure that it is useful, that it is taken up as the remarkable opportunity that it is. National IP&R gives us the opportunity to increase our control over our own futures, to restructure and stabilise our economy, to rescue the basis of that economy, namely our natural environment, our social cohesion and our equality as free-speaking participants in Australia's democracy. It gives us this opportunity by establishing a new basis for our relationship with our political leaders. Australia Together, if it is built using National IP&R, establishes the basis on which they can regain our trust. And so I'd like to explain just a little more about this before I move on to the last episode in the series. In the aftermath of its 2019 election loss, the Australian Labor Party, in their search for the truth about why they lost what many thought was an unlosable election, toyed briefly with an idea put forward by one of their younger elected members, Claire O'Neill. She said that politics is about offering a compelling story about our country, who we are and where we are going. She was speaking from the point of view that politics is where leadership happens in a democracy, and from the point of view that inspiration can only come from the top. But in a democracy, it's meant to come from the bottom, from we, the people. That's what democracy is. And if that inspiration doesn't come from us, then the top-down type of leadership that creeps in to fill the vacuum is nothing more than an imposition of an ideology that can only benefit the few, not the many. At best, it might be benefiting about half of us, at least for a short time. At worst, it is probably only benefiting sectional or large corporate interests. And when those circumstances prevail, democracies start their way down the path to corruption and decline. In Australia, this sort of reliance on top-down leadership has now resulted in a stark growth in perceived corruption in our governments. The last views of surveys by Transparency International in their Corruption Perceptions Index show that Australians can see corruption happening, and happening openly, as though there will be no consequences, and there is no fear in some politicians that they will be held accountable. At the moment, other than by elections, everyday Australians have no effective means of holding governments accountable, and elections are not working well for that purpose. They're certainly not working to make governments set the nation up so that we are prepared for the future. Elections also don't work to help future generations hold governments to account, because future generations don't vote. So we need to find a way to hold them to account now on behalf of those who can't yet speak. To do that, it is we, and not politicians, who must offer a compelling story about our country, about who we are and where we are going. We have to assemble a coherent picture of the safe paths to a preferred future, drive it home to politicians, lift their sights beyond the short term, and keep refining that picture as we go. With National Integrated Planning and Reporting, we should be able to form a covenant with two key partners in our future. One partner to this covenant is future generations themselves. And if we work out a respectful, fair agreement between us and them, which we can only do with a long-term plan, then we can form an agreement with the other partner, namely each government that we elect. Instead of handing over power without instructions, we can form an agreement with clear terms about what we expect, clear instructions on what they can use power for and what they can't do with it. Without a plan like Australia Together, the power that we give governments in elections can be far too easily abused. It is being abused. But if we have an inclusive, integrated plan, like Australia Together, we can strike fair agreements between this generation and those of the future, and then we can ask governments to join in on those agreements to help us adhere to them. Plans like Australia Together can't bind the representatives we elect, but they do specify the minimum of responsibility, the standard below which we don't want them to fall. At the moment, they can breach that standard because there's nothing setting out either what the standard is or how it can be honoured. If, on the other hand, we establish a strong inclusive plan like Australia Together, we can relieve the pressure on politicians, pressure which routinely grinds many of them down into unethical behaviour, suboptimal political compromises and deals, and policies which benefit the few rather than the many. Most politicians enter Parliament with a sense of ethics and decency, but as they sit in Parliament for years and sometimes decades, they really have no way of resisting being slowly dragged away from decency and fairness. It happens to them all, to varying degrees. But if they can hold up a National Community Futures Plan, they at least have something behind them that enables them to resist the growth of bad policy and corruption. And to the extent that they commit to such a plan, it should be able to increase their chances of being elected and attaining longevity in office, if only because they will have been able to demonstrate to us that they honour the particular trust we placed in them. Australia Together, if it is well built by we the people, means it is no longer necessary for us to place blind trust in those we elect. Everyone gets a better understanding of what is really in the national interest, what they've really been elected for, and therefore what they're really being trusted with. I don't know of any other way for Australians to be able to direct elected representatives along the paths that are in the national interest. Our constitution is so outdated that it's no longer fit for this purpose. It comes from a period of 19th century imperialism, a time of racism, sexism, parochialism, warmongering, violent cultural clashes, disrespect for nature and myriad forms of inequality, aggression and theft that in no way fit with the irretrievably globalised world we must find a way to live in today. We might think that we have legislation which protects our way of life and our rights, but in the 21st century our rights have been substantially diminished because the Constitution doesn't forbid that. Australians are very unlikely to be given the opportunity to change their constitution for some time yet, although change it we must if we wish to secure rights. But in the meantime, while we still have hope that we can exercise free speech in our democracy, we can plan a better future for our children. And these sorts of plans can be exciting, far more exciting than the sort of offers we get from politicians who are strapped into short-term party political platforms. National Integrated Planning and Reporting gives us the best opportunity we've ever been offered to shape a positive future. In the next and last episode in this series, I'll set out some of those exciting opportunities and try to show what can come from National IP&R. Thanks for watching this episode. If you like this program, please click like on the YouTube page and share the program with your friends and subscribe to this channel.